I'll get started here. So I'm Derek. I'm one of the reference librarians here at the Hudson Library. You may have seen me around. So basically, my passion is military records. So I was lucky enough to get invited back to talk about something different. And today I'm going to talk about pension records, specifically the Civil War. There's a reason why. I'll get into that later, but I thought this might be an interesting thing just because there's so much material out there. So I have a little PowerPoint. I'll get going here on that and then I'll talk. So this is probably going to be about an hour, and don't worry, there'll be time for questions at the very end. So you can always put those in there's the Q&A at the bottom, and then on the right-hand side, there's a chat window. So go ahead and feel free to ask questions. Don't be shy. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Then hopefully everybody can see that, and I'll get going here. So as the title says, we are doing Civil War pensions, specifically Union, and there's a reason why. Mainly it's just there's so much material out there. Nothing against Confederates that did fight, but I just thought it'd be easier to show some of the things I found online for specifically the Civil War. So let me just check something here. Okay, so we have, go back to this. There we go. So one of the things you may have kind of noticed is, why isn't everything online? Now, that's kind of one of the things I found out when I was a young person doing research many, many years ago. I kind of got frustrated. Why is everything online? Well, there's a reason. The simple answer is space. Not everything can be digitized. Makes sense, right? And we'll get into some numbers here in the next slide, but there are dozens and dozens of papers that are involved with the pension record. You probably won't ever see all those unless you actually do. At the very end, we'll talk about how to get from the National Archives a pension record. But with that being said, there are some things online, and you may have come across those on Fold and Ancestry. What you will probably find a lot of, and we'll talk about that at the end, are the pension index cards. So you might have seen those and wondered what those are. So we'll get into those. But the first part, we're going to talk about what a pension is and how did you apply for one. So on the right-hand side there, you can see there's a picture of the 1900 circa pension building that was built by the United States government, and it was for exactly what the name is. It's for pensions because there were so many pensions. Now, way back when, you only had a couple people, maybe a dozen clerks or so pre-Civil War. After the Civil War, you had a building, and you had dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And if you can see it in there, there's all these little, it looks like little envelopes. That's a pension application. And if you can tell on the very far right-hand side, there's all these papers. Those are pension applications. So a lot of stuff to digitize, so they haven't done it. But you can make an inquiry about that and get your own. So we're going to move on here, and paperwork. Just think of all the paperwork. So not that much paperwork like on the right-hand side there, but for the most part, it's a lot involved. Now, I'm not going to test you on these numbers, but I just wanted to give you some background why you may be wondering how much is out there to research. Well, quite a lot. So I pulled these numbers from the internet. I've looked around. I'd say they're probably fairly accurate. I have about 2 million men from the Union who served. Again, just the Union, and that's in every branch, whether you're talking about artillery, cavalry, so on and so forth. So that's people that served in combat, not in combat. From that number, you have about 80 to 90%, give or take. And that's people that have requested a pension, may not be received a pension, but started the process. And there's a reason for that. We'll talk about that again. So I'm just kind of dipping your toes in here to the information here, if you will. So again, I mentioned it is a process, and they could be started or stopped at any time, and they could be added to. So that's why a lot of those things in the previous file looked like a giant envelope. So as you can imagine, voluminous all over the place. And National Archives has most of them. So in other words, you won't probably find any of these at, say, Ohio Historical Society or anything that's state level. So why file a claim, right? This may seem like a simple question. It is initially. So initially, you would file a pension claim because of an injury, right? You maybe lost an arm, or there was a shell fragment and it injured your eye, something along those lines. So it's a disability, we would call that. They actually use the term invalid. You may have seen that on things. It's not invalid, it's invalid. So that's what they're talking about. So initially it was being injured. Could be a disease too. You could have picked up a disease in the camps and been bedridden or caught something else and had to have been mustered out, discharged. Now later, we'll talk about this, you could get one for being, I don't want to use the O word, old, but at a certain point, you could apply for a pension when you're older. Now on the right-hand screen there, you can see what's called a surgeon's certificate. So what that basically means is, as you can see in the bottom right, there's a person. And what that meant is a surgeon, if let's say, for example, you got mustered out of the military because of a wound or a disease, you would get that. And what that meant is they had to document it. So they had to say things like you had to get your arm unfortunately amputated, or you were deaf, or you got a disease. So this surgeon is essentially, you can only see the one side here. It would have been in your application. They would have had access to this to basically say this person on such and such a date was injured and mustered out of the military. Now, nowadays we have things, of course, via the internet and things like that. Well, this was your sort of record, if you will. And this would have went in your file. You wouldn't have gotten this. You probably would have gotten something signed by the military, like for example, a surgeon, but you wouldn't have gotten, like we call it, a carbon copy. You wouldn't have gotten that. They didn't have copy machines, so everything was handwritten at this time. So who can file a claim? This is kind of the big thing here. So basically, the way it started is after the effect, and it could be during the war. It might not be until many, many years after the war until it became an issue, but the veteran would have to start it. Now, actually somebody else did before, but I'm just going to keep things simple here before I start to get into things a little complicated. So a veteran could do that. The main thing is they had to be honorably discharged. It goes without saying, but if somebody, let's say, went AWOL and came back, potentially, if they left and never came back, they would be dishonorably discharged, so no pension. Okay. A widow or a mother of the veteran, they could have gotten that. Now, there wasn't a rule per se, but if the widow or the mother of the veteran remarried, they would lose the pension. Now, this looks weird, but stay with me. So let's say that somebody was married to a veteran passed away and had a pension, widow would have to apply for it. They didn't just automatically get it. So it's going to be a separate number. We'll see that in a few minutes. Now let's say this widow remarried. They could do that, but they would lose the pension. But let's say that that person passed away. So the person unfortunately lost two husbands. If both of those veterans did have pensions, she could combine the two pensions into one. Sounds weird, but I have seen that online, so that is possible. And the other thing is children. Now, the thing is, usually that means the parents aren't around. I would say that's probably 99% true. If they're over the age of 16, they couldn't get a pension. Under, yes, they would have to apply. In case you're wondering, the guardian would file on the behalf of somebody. So if you ever see one of the index cards and it says G, that's a guardian. So in other words, the children aren't writing or anything like that. The guardian would have to supply information. Okay, so this isn't going to be a test, don't worry, but I'm just giving you information about some of the pension acts that were started, just because it wasn't just a one-size-fits-all. There was a lot of things going on in Washington during the war and after the war. Pensions were a big thing. So we have a couple acts here. So they had to get changed because of so many men essentially applying, which it made sense, right? 2 million men, give or take. You know, they're all applying for pensions. It's going to be crazy. So they had to have some kind of benchmark. So in 1862, because there were so many people applying for pensions, and remember at this time, injury or illness. So there was an act in 1862 that basically said, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but it basically said that Civil War veterans who sustained war-related disabilities, they could claim a pension. So in other words, injury and sickness, like I mentioned. Now, the pension could be available to widows, children under 16 age. So essentially everything that I mentioned in the previous file there, or dependents. So a mother or father. And I've seen fathers sometimes apply for that too. And I've checked in the census and they're living alone and no children are there. So a father or a mother of the deceased veteran could apply from war injuries. So in other words, they could have passed away from that. MIA, we would use that term. So there's a couple other ones there that I've mentioned. The big one is 1890. That one you could do for age. The 1907, it's basically the same thing as 1890, and they all build off each other. The 1872 one, I kind of did this out of order, but that one basically says that everything is true from the 1862. And basically it said that dependents, mother or father or children, so on and so forth, could get a lump sum. So again, you get a pension, depending on whatever, for monthly. You would get a monthly thing until theoretically the person would pass away. So with that being said, then they did a lump sum. So you get a check. I don't know exactly when it would be sent, but it would be a lump sum. And that's in addition to monthly. So in other words, let's say they got a pension for service. And on top of that, there was an extra one for, let's say, unfortunately, that person lost both limbs. Or they had to be, essentially, you would be amputated on the battlefield and maybe it wasn't done correctly. So you'd have to get, as weird as it sounds, re-amputated. You'd have to get more surgery. So we would use the term malpractice, but that could have been what happened. So you'd have to prove it and you could get a pension. So you might be looking at the date there, 1907, and think, wow. But keep in mind, if they were born in the 1840s, they could have potentially lived after the 1900s. And there's pension files that go right up until the 1940s. And most of the time, that's going to be family members, a wife or children, potentially. But sounds a little weird, but there were veterans living alone into the 1940s. Okay, so here's the thing here, age. So in the 1890s, you could claim a pension on everything I've mentioned, including age. There's a reason why that is. I won't get into the particulars. A lot of it was politics-based. A lot of it had to do with the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic. A lot of these individuals that were in them were essentially, for lack of a better term, asking for what we would call health care. You know, family members have moved away, so on and so forth, and they didn't really have much. So without the 1890 law, they probably wouldn't have been able to go, we would call it nursing care, but somebody to take care of them. So, you know, money for medical bills. But again, with the 1890s, you had a huge, 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 huge increase. How huge? Well, let me give you some numbers here. So before that 1862 benchmark that I mentioned, you had about 10,000 or so, and that was 1862 and afterwards. Before the Civil War, there was about 11,000. Sounds like a lot, but again, there was a lot of people from War of 1812, Mexican-American War, Indian Wars, as they called them, very general term, or military service. So you're talking about like the lieutenant colonels, the generals, and so on and so forth. So these are all different things going on here. So after 1862, just to give you kind of an idea, there was about, again, about 10,000 applications. That's Civil War, not previous. Only about 658 were granted. You might be saying, that seems a little low. Well, there's a reason. So remember that picture I showed a little bit ago that said, yeah, this is the pension office, and there's all those files on there. A lot of files to go through, and nothing was co-located like that. That was later. We'll see what those are later. But they had to essentially go to all the branches and collect all this information. So it was very slow. That's why the pensions office was built in Washington, D.C. So how much numbers did they spike afterwards? So 1890. So again, 1862, about 11,000. 1190, That information you can see there, all true. Now we had about 537,944. So that's a huge spike. 1893, even more. You had about 966,000, give or take. So that's a huge spike. And the reason mainly is because of the 1890. Also advertising. We'll see a picture of that later. But there was advertising in papers, in case you're wondering about this. So I looked at the bottom there. Those numbers in my mind doesn't seem right, but as far as I could understand, how long was a veteran living up to this point? They could have been born in the 1840s or 50s, so theoretically they'd be 18, 19, which was the limit. Drummer boys and things like that, I don't know if they could apply for pensions, so we're just talking about an 18-year, 19-year-old. Theoretically, yes, people did get under that, so they could have lied about their age and said they're 15, 16, 17 when they're really, that could happen too, but we're not worried about that. We're just worried about the average soldier. So life expectancy could be about 48, 50, give or take. And with good health care, they had soldiers and sailors home, they could be living longer. And yes, those pensions could be used to pay for that, to defer payment. So we're getting into the nitty gritty here, how to file a claim. So the soldier, as weird as this sounds, has to prove he was in the military. So this sounds weird, but you have to kind of prove you're in there. And there's some things you had to do on your own. Like, for example, you had to get essentially they call it an affidavit, which is a sworn statement from a comrade. So if you're in a small town like Hudson, like here, you had a number of people that served, or in 1863, went for the draft. You might have came back to Hudson after the war, or Twinsburg, or Aurora. So you would probably know your neighbors very well. So because of that, they would kind of sign a letter saying, I've known this person for X amount of years, I've served, and so on and so forth. So like a historian writing a book, you kind of have to prove. Now, before I go on, yes, the military is going to look into this, but this is essentially you saying, I'm this person, I've lived here, places, and so on and so forth. You may have to get a physician's affidavit if it was an injury or long-term. Makes sense, right? If you, let's say, had a sickness that's caused you from doing something. Well, your doctor, your physician is probably going to know that better than anyone. So he's going to write something that essentially says, I've treated this person, so on and so forth. You may ask, affidavit, where do I go with those? So one of the things I do at the library is I'm a notary public. So you would go before a clerk of courts, notary public, and basically swear and say, I'm this person, so on and so forth. Oh, and by the way, you didn't have birth certificates at this time. So that's how you would kind of prove, if you will, when you were born. And that all went in the pension application. And you would need an affidavit of marriage if the widow is filing. You could do that if you got a copy. If you went to a church, they could do a marriage license copy, or a pastor or priest or whoever could basically say, okay, I've known this person for such and such time. They're married on this date. And that's to prove essentially that somebody isn't trying to take advantage of the system, which did happen, but that's why you needed all this information. A little bit more of things like claiming. So sometimes a veteran's claim could be dropped. It happens. I mentioned fraudulence. Won't get into the specifics, but yes, there were people that did lie and say, I'm this person for whatever reason. But, and I've given you in your packet, it's kind of a manila looking thing, but it says examples of pension records. So there's one on there in particular, and his name is Oriel Crane, and he was in the Navy and he's from Hudson. So this poor man tried to apply for a pension and he was rejected, and he was probably in need of one, but it was a mistake. He put the wrong year by 1 year. So that could happen. You could get rejected because you made a mistake. So, you know, don't think everybody that's applying for this is trying to cheat the system. But again, if you do happen to look at a pension file like Oriel Crane, you can see the back and forth going between him and the government saying, yeah, I should get a pension because of this reason. I'm paraphrasing it, but again, process. That's why these files are very, very big. And speaking of enlarging the process, or the packet rather, the veteran could apply for an increase. So their condition could get worse. We would say bedridden, Unfortunately, they use the word crippled, but if you couldn't walk anymore, you could apply for a pension and say, this injury has caused me to essentially not be able to take care of myself. So I need a pension increase, which could happen, or they could deny it. But again, you had to prove this injury and this bedridden, whatever you want to call it, is because of the injury. It isn't something after the war. So you had to prove this was part of the war. Now, this is kind of weird, but you see this term down there that says the means test. So what this means is, again, this is kind of a thing that they applied to widows, and it had to be, again, unmarried. They could get married, but they would lose the pension. And this only lasted for a few years, but basically what this meant is the widow couldn't own valuable property. So let's say huge amount of land, because theoretically you could sell that and make money. Or you couldn't have any other form of income. So it's a kind of a weird thing, but they sort of did that to crack down on people to say, well, if you have income coming in from land, maybe tenants are on it, you don't need a pension. That was taken out 1900s, I believe around 1907. And again, children, they could apply for that, and the guardians usually would do that. So we have here another thing about filing. So before I start talking about this, all this information you see here, I just took these from newspapers in the area online. And this is a big business back in the 1800s and 1900s. And I say it's a business because there were a lot of pension officers and employees and lawyers that did this, that specialized this. So on the right-hand side, you see all these wonderful articles. And this was one sliver. It was a giant page of pensions. And I sort of tricked you. I said the veteran starts it. Not really. The lawyer would do it on your behalf, although the veteran had to get information. And you might think, well, how did they know all this? Well, in that middle there, if you can see that, it says pension list. The New York Sun is publishing the name of those receiving pensions from the government. It's advertising in the newspaper. It's good advertising because you might say, oh, I didn't know you could get a pension. A lot of veterans didn't apply for pensions. Some did. Sounds weird saying that, but some did. And articles like this would say $72 a month, as you could say, and then somebody else got $50 a month. Now, that could be any number of reasons. So just to give you an example, who did the filing here? So really the pension lawyer would start the process, and they were a specific type of lawyer. In other words, you wouldn't just go to any lawyer, you would go to a pension lawyer. They were in big cities like Akron, Cleveland, Canton. Hudson, as far as I know, didn't have one, but they had ties. So you would essentially have to start the process doing the filing there. And you would have to go in person. Initially, it was not. It was you could send a letter. And the reason, as you could imagine, is that could be fraudulent. But you had to essentially go in person and say, I'd like to apply for a pension. Why? And you would essentially say the reasons, okay, and this pension lawyer would know all this information. So that would help. And also, I should mention that GAR posts, like we had one in Hudson during the time, they would know all this information. They may not have the paperwork, but you would have somebody that may be a GAR president would know all this information. So that would help too. And the rise of the GAR did help with all these pension laws and whatnot. So if they didn't have the GAR behind them, you probably wouldn't get the 1872 law, the 1890, the 1907, so on and so forth. So it was kind of a two-way street, because if you increase the pensions, you had a bunch of people that were living longer, but they could vote. So there was a little bit of back scratching going on there. So let's talk about pension lawyers. So did they do this for free? I know you're probably wondering. No, they didn't. Now you see that number there, $10. You might think, wow, that's a lot of money. It is for that time. But remember a minute ago, I showed you that article. It said $50. That was one of the widows that got that per month. So per month, it's a flat fee for $10. And they would get paid after. And again, fail or success. So it sounds like a lot. It really isn't, if you're talking about somebody that knows how to essentially do this. And you might be wondering, was there a lot of corruption? There was initially. they did have something that was called the special service that would essentially go in person, essentially talk to these lawyers, or if there was a veteran. And usually it was something that was earmarked. You would have somebody that would say, this doesn't sound right. And it would go up the chain of command. So one person would check it out, another person would, and then somebody maybe at the head agency of the pension office would say, okay, I'm going to send an agent out there. Now, again, no emails, phone, potentially, telegraph, probably not, but they would probably send a person out. So in the back of your mind, yes, this takes a long time to get a pension filed. I don't know how long on average, but probably a couple months, give or take. But again, small office, overworked, overstaffed, understaffed. A lot of these things were going on there. So you may be asking yourself, how much, right? Well, on average, and again, we're talking about that golden age, if you will, of pensions, 1880, 1890, it was about $12 a month on average. And that could be service, rank, which I didn't mention. Again, we're just talking about like a private, nobody up the command of chains, but somebody that served for, we'll say on average, a couple years to 3 months. That's sort of a wide range, but that's kind of a benchmark. And of course, things like rank, that helped too. Higher the rank, the more money you got, the more severity of the injury, the more you got. And also, it's subject to a physician's report. So this is backing this up. You know, obviously, if, let's say your arm unfortunately had to be amputated or a finger, you knew that. People around you knew that. But you can't take a photograph of that and send it to them. I suppose you could, but that's what the report is. So again, you're documenting this. Now later on, again, it was a lump sum. Now on the right-hand corner there, this is one of the index cards I won't have, fortunately, time to talk about, but it's a payment card voucher is what it's called. And these are on fold. So it's kind of hard to see all these little numbers here, but this is a way they tracked a person. It looks like Caroline S. Moulton, so probably a veteran's widow. And these are all the payments. And if you can read it there, it says September 20th, 1916. So wow, that's well after the Civil War. But again, people were living longer. Or this could have been Spanish-American War, War of 1812, probably not. Indian Wars, yep. Mexican-American War, probably not. So a lot of these index cards are sort of mixed together, and I'll talk about that later. But they did keep track of this. And that's one of the things they did was with these index cards. And one of the other things too is they had what was called a total disability. So basically what that meant is somebody that cannot perform manual labor, severe conditions of labor. So what we would say is, you know, they're disabled. They call total disability. It's not necessarily bedridden, but it means that they can't really do things, for lack of a better term. And that could have been because of the injury, because of the illness. Again, they had to prove it. So this is a little bit more into how much. So just to give you an example there, 1862, remember that? So on average, $8, doesn't sound like a lot. You know, things back then didn't cost much. But increased and increased and increased. So again, you go from 1866 to $20, $24. And again, things could be sort of added together. It sounds horrible saying this, but you know, if you lost at the bottom there, you know, 2 limbs or 2 hands or 2 eyes, that could be considered a total disability, and you would get $25 a month. That's on average. Again, it could be higher than that, but that's how they sort of qualitated all these numbers together, and they figured it out how much you would get per month. And again, it's a process. You could have said, we would call it cost of living adjustment, but you know, there was in the 1890s, there was a huge, they call it a panic. It was essentially a recession, but there was a lot of out-of-work people, almost as much as in the 1930s. But for our veteran friends here, a lot of individuals, and that's why there was part of that spike, asked for an increase because things cost too much and they couldn't take care of themselves. You didn't have really retirement homes and things like that. You had these soldiers and sailors homes. Cleveland had one, Akron had one, Cincinnati. So that money could have been used for that, for essentially payment of living there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1890 census. And you might be wondering why. Well, there's a reason. They involve veterans. So yes, unfortunately, most of the 1890 census was up in smoke. So it's horrible. We would all like to see it, but most of it was destroyed in the 1920s, I believe the fire was. Some things were saved. And one thing was, and we have this on microfilm at the library and it's online, is the Veterans Census. And you might be saying 1890. Yep. So remember that law I talked about that they passed? That's why. One of the reasons they did this was, and you can see on the right, this is the Veterans Census or Veterans Schedule. And the reason why they did this is they knew there was going to be a huge influx of veterans. And essentially, they wanted to get a listing of individuals. So this was left at people's doorsteps. So keep in mind, they may not have filled this out, a veteran. And this is Confederate and Union, mostly going to be Union, but there were Confederates that did get this. And this has to do with essentially when they went in, when they went out. So their service record, if you will. But it's great because when you search for a name, these will come up. And men from Hudson filled these out. And this is all sent back with the 1890 census with the enumerator back to Washington, D.C. Now, why did it escape the fire? These copies were made, and some of them, most of them, in fact, were in the pension office. So these have stayed, and these are a great research tool, not just for military. You might be saying, well, why is that? Simple reason is people were listed on this. And I say people in plural because let's say George Church, who was a veteran here in Hudson, filled it out, didn't apply for a pension. Okay, that's something you could check into. But let's say if George Church wasn't around, he died in 1889. Okay, his name would be listed. Also, his wife, his widow, and that would be on there too. So that's a good way to check things. If the widow's on there and you don't know when somebody's passed away, you could look on this veteran census and see that. Now, it's not going to give you an exact date, but you could say, okay, 1890, he wasn't around then. Now, it might be 2 days before the enumerator came around, so you're going to have to check other sources. But this is a good way to sort of check into things and say, hey, I wonder if this person was around. And by the way, I'll show you an example of some of the writing. It can be a little scratchy. So this is one thing I love showing, and I'm going to show you one of these things. So we have this. This is called the Roster of Ohio Soldiers. So we have these at the Hudson Library, and I have an example there, but I'll kind of zoom in here and show you. So what is this? This is the title, The Official Roster of Soldiers of the State of Ohio in the War of Rebellion, 1861 to 1866. Why 1866? Men didn't, they call it demobilized, but they didn't muster out of the military until that date. So that's why that's kind of that range there. So what is this? And how does this have to do with, of course, we're talking about pension records? Well, simple reason is there's a lot of information on here. So what's on here? So this is specifically for Ohio. And the way this worked is there were subscriptions. So basically you paid 20 or 25 bucks. And roughly in about, 1880s, 1890s, these things came about. And we have them, State of Ohio, library has them, I think Twinsburg does. You might have seen them and you might have wondered what's going on with these. So there's no index. That's something I'd like to do someday. But with that being said, if you know somebody that was in the Civil War, you know their branch, artillery, infantry, so on and so forth, unit name and company, you could find them. So if you can see it in there, it's all arranged by last name, first name, or if you're like, for example, a captain here, it's going to be first name, last name. But this is where things get interesting. This is essentially their, if you will, their service record. Now, these have been transcribed and put on Ancestry. So you will see Civil War service records. That's what this is. Somebody transcribed it. But what's interesting is this has how long they're in, entry, muster in, muster out. Were they killed in combat? Did they get transferred? So both military and genealogy, but whoops, the age, you can't really see it there, but it's down sort of that middle there between rank. Now, birth certificates didn't exist until about the 1920s in Ohio. Other states were different. You might not know when somebody was born. It might be all over the place. But when they mustered in the military, they always asked their age because you had to be 18 or older. So guess what? It's going to say their age there. So you can give a little plus or minus and say, okay, this person was born 1834. Look in the census. Okay. Why is that date going to come into play later? You're going to need to know roughly when they were born for their pension record. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, and you can use that for genealogy stuff. The very bottom there's a website, hopefully you can read that, but it's called catalog.hathietrust.org. What is that? So there's something called the Wayback Machine or the Internet Machine.org. That's kind of like this. And these have digitized things like this wonderful Ohio roster of the soldiers. So that'll be on there. You'd have to actually type that in to find that, but that's just in case, maybe like today, if it was really snowing and didn't want to go out, well, you can find this stuff on Ancestry, or if you don't have Ancestry, you can find it here. You can also Google. There's a lot of roster reports and things like that, but I just thought I'd point that out. Okay, so we're gonna take a break here for a second, and I'm gonna show you just kind of one of the things I was looking at and how this class kind of came about. I was researching essentially people that were from Hudson that served during the Civil War. And I looked at that 1890 veteran schedule. So I have somebody here that I thought was Nathan Camp, but it actually came up Matthew Camp. And I thought, well, that's weird. Why am I getting this weird thing? And this is kind of a cautionary tale, and that's always click on the record that's been transcribed from. Sometimes the handwriting, as you can tell there with this frowny face, could be poor. Sometimes it doesn't match up. Well, let me show you here. This is our friend Nathan or Matthew Camp. So hopefully you can read that. Doesn't that kind of look like Nathan or Matthew Camp? It's actually Matthew Camp. But still, the handwriting is really difficult to read. So that's why, again, I was talking about this roster of Ohio soldiers, because this is all typeset. This isn't handwriting. Do errors occur in this? Yeah. Will they appear on Ancestry? Possibly. But again, I like to get all my ducks in a row. And also, like if you see there, it says C29, looks like COMM. It's actually Connecticut, 29th Connecticut, Company C. Now, things like that happen. Doesn't mean it's anybody's fault, but my guess is what happened is Ancestry sort of pulled this information off, whether somebody did it or not, but a little bit of a cautionary tale. Okay, so now we're going to talk about pension application index cards, and you may have seen these things. Now, some of these things are kind of exactly what you see is what you get. Some aren't. And I've put on in your folder or your handouts, there's a little thing in here that basically talks about essentially like some of the abbreviations, because it sounds like it's alphabet soup, but really it's just to keep the note takers, when they're writing all this stuff down, their hands are cramping up. They don't want to write stuff out because, again, they have to do a bunch of these per day. So there's 3 index cards, and these have all been microfilmed. And that's why I said always look at different things, because a lot of the times this microfilm is in really poor shape for whatever reason. So again, you may have to look at a number of sources if things don't jive. So there's 3 types, and the 3 types are in the packet that I give you. So the 3 that I'm going to show you, I've done essentially a larger picture, and it's the same thing. So in other words, it'll correspond to the one that I'm showing you. So there's a T88. You don't need to worry about that name. That's just what the National Archives called it. So there's the alphabetical index, the organizational index, numerical index. And these are on Ancestry or Fold, or also Family Search. So they're kind of all over the place. So before I go into that, this is something that you may have found. You may have thought, what the heck is this? This is something like, it says service records sometimes in some places. It sort of is. It's called a service card index. It's part of what's called a CMSR, Compiled Military Service Record. We'll see an example of this in a minute. But this is something that's part of the pension application. Remember those envelopes on the desk? That's something that would have been in there. It's a reference or an index card. So how is this useful? So basically, this is after the Civil War, in case you're wondering. And they did this for all wars, as you can see down there. So Revolution, War of 1812, so on and so forth. They stopped about the Spanish-American War. But these cards are essentially printed after the effect. And they're pretty much exactly what you can see there. So they're very not confusing. Last name, first name, company. That's very important in the Civil War, by the way, what company they're in, because there's a lot of men in every unit. And it looks like it says private twice. That's rank in and out. So very useful if you're looking for an individual, especially if it's John Smith. A lot of those, by the way. And at the bottom there, originally filed under. Looks like Michael McCabe. It's spelled different. McCabery. That happened a lot. And it could just be a clerical issue. It could be an alias. We'll see that in a second there. But again, keep that in mind when you're researching somebody. It could be misspelled, especially if it's somebody that has a name that's from a different nationality. Sometimes it wasn't spelled correctly. I've seen things that are spelled wrong. Okay, so this is, you may have seen this on Fold. I don't think these are on Ancestry, but these are called CMSR, and they should be Civil War and some other wars. But essentially, this is what was created after. Remember that pension application? So they took, once the pension application or the pension office was built in around the 1800s, all this information, it was all scattered. So you have essentially something they've put together that is the pension. This isn't the military per se, and it's all this different information. So for example, there's a muster in, there's muster out. You might have, let's say, an injury. So you might not be on the company roster for a while. You may have had a rank, which may or may not enter it. You may have been AWOL. So a number of different things. But these are going to be cards, like I showed you previously, that are going to be in an envelope. And this is all co-located to be in one place so they can check this pension. Because otherwise, they would have to travel and find all these things or hire somebody like a courier to get it. But this was put together much, much, much later. So this is what one looks like. You may have seen this. So again, remember those little envelopes on the desk? That's what this is. And on the left-hand side there, this looks confusing, but it's like that index card that I showed you. So it has the person's name. And yes, if you look this name up on Fold, this is what you're going to get. So unit, muster in, muster out, captain, captain. And then you see 1 through, it looks like 45. So what that means is you're going to have cards like the one on the right. That's the first one. And then it looks like it's 19333. That just has to do with a notation on the back. Usually it's a file number. So that's what that means. You don't need to worry about that. But on the right there, that's all located in one easy thing. So in this case, this is when George came in and muster enroll. So Harrisburg, PA, at that date, this is when he enrolled. And again, these are a number of things that have been digitized. And this can help you if you're trying to figure out if it's the right person. How old were they? 29 years old. Okay, that sounds like the person. Now, again, you may just be looking for an individual specifically for military records or for their pension, because again, you're trying to figure out this is the right person. So it'll show all that. Okay, so now we're actually going to do the index cards here. So this is the first one. We're just going to call it the alphabetical index. You don't need to worry about that T something, something, something. That's just the way they sort of separate things on the National Archives. So this is called the alphabetical index. Why is that? Very simple. A for Allen. So it's going to be alphabetical. And I picked a halfway decent example just to show you, mainly because, again, this is pulled off microfilm, so it's pretty poor. This is actually one you could read. So if you're looking at this, you can use this for genealogy or for applying for a pension. So let me explain here what's going on here. So at the top there, you see, oh, okay, Clarence Allen. And then you see an alias, excuse me, and you think, wait, what? So one of the things I found out is that people didn't always use their correct name. That doesn't mean nefarious, doesn't mean somebody's lying about their name. But like with this individual, his name was Rodney Clarence or C. Allen, also known as Clarence Allen. So keep that in the back of your mind. Sometimes people did that. They didn't put their middle name on the census records, but muster in, muster out reports, you might get that. So keep that in the back of your mind, that may be the name, even though it's the same unit, service, as you can see down there. And sometimes they write it like this. Like in this case, G, company G, 8th Massachusetts Infantry. So that's usually how they write that. It isn't unit name and then company. Again, apples and oranges, but just to keep that back in your mind. You can also see there, name a dependent. So like taxes, you have a dependent, right? So somebody a widow in this case, Jane Allen. So you could use this for genealogy and say he was married to somebody. Ah, somebody filed Jane Allen. No children? Well, maybe, but they didn't apply for one, or maybe they didn't have children. So again, you can kind of use this for that information. It's kind of hard to read down there, but it looks like there were 2 pensions filed. One was in 1903. So first thing your mind says, that person was alive then. Why? Because they were granted a pension. How do I know that? Certificate number. That means they were granted one. If they were not, wouldn't have it in there. State from which filed. I wish it had the county and the area, but it doesn't. But Massachusetts. So that can help you narrow down where they're at. Now in this case, Massachusetts twice. Sometimes the widow of the deceased veteran would move. So that can help you out go, okay, censuses are what? 10 years, right? Every 10 years? In between there, you can find that out. Also, you can see there, separate certificate, separate application number. It's going to be for, looks like 1922, October 24th. So again, you may not have a death certificate. You may, I don't know about when Massachusetts had them, but if you can't find it, like find a grave, or maybe you try to go to an infirmary and get some death records and you don't find anything, you could probably say that this person passed away in 1922, probably before that, and the widow applied for that. So again, plus or minus. So at the bottom there of this index card, attorney, remember the attorneys I talked about? So it's got a name there. And that's usually just in case they need to investigate. So again, that is the alphabetical. So here's another one. This is called the pension numerical index. This one's a little confusing. So you forgive me if I don't know everything about this. Now, this is a weird sort of index. And again, you're going to find these on Ancestry, and you're going to find these on Fold as well. That number in the upper left-hand corner is going to be on every one of these people, and they're not related. It looks weird, but my guess is why they had these is to save space. And this would be something that somebody could quickly check. So you have a lot of these different names like CIF, serve, name, original. You know, a lot of these things were just abbreviated, like certificate number, org is the originator of that. And it's good to check these, like the name William Yates there. See if that he was in the 81st Independent Indiana. Ah, yeah. So some of these abbreviations are a little hard to read. Looks like infantry, probably infantry. Looks like E, probably an E. But I can tell you he was granted a pension because there's a certificate number. So again, you'll find the abbreviations on the thing there, but it's split up. It could be into 4 people on there. And oh, by the way, there could be people from other wars on here. Don't ask me why, but these aren't just Civil War. It's going forward. So Indian Wars, could be Spanish-American War, but mostly it's going to be Civil War people. So you're going to have invalids, not invalid, and then dependents. So usually it's somebody asking for a pension on behalf. That's going to be less common, you're going to find on there, but most of them are going to be the first one, or yeah, this one here, the organizational index. So what's going on with this one? This is a lot like the first one I showed you, the alphabetical. And a little bit more information. And this is organized, in case you're wondering, by, well, the unit organization. So it's going to be by, you know, in this case, the 1st Regiment of the Ohio Infantry, then it goes by company, then it goes by the last name. I can see off the bat there's a big DEAD. So that's to give this person that's filing the claim going, okay, this person passed away. If you look at this card, there's a lot of same information, but more. So you have a dependent, you have a widow, it looks like, certificate number. Law, you might be wondering what that is. That just has to do with specific law that might have been passed, whether it's state or federal that impacted that. Could be payment, could be other things. Service, this is great, talks about the unit. Also, it talks about when they enlisted or discharged, which is helpful because if you find this ahead of time, you can go, okay, let me just check into this. Yep, that's the right person. Additional service could be re-enlisting, could be volunteer unit, looks like. Why would they put that on there? You can get another pension for that for somebody that was in another unit. And it could be somebody that was transferred. It could be somebody that maybe got into the unit afterwards, re-enlisted, volunteered, sort of the same thing interchangeably. But at the very bottom, you notice it says died and attorney, but that can give you a good date that when they passed away. Now, most of these index cards are scanned, roughly in about 90 to 99% time. So again, if you're trying to figure out before you apply when somebody passed away, you may see if they have this organization. So one of the things you may be, of course, wondering is, you know, why use all these cards? Well, you know, potentially you could just look at one, or, you know, our famous Ohio book and find out all the information. You're probably not going to, but it's best to check, especially when you get into things like a few minutes ago, I showed you that individual that used what I think was their middle name as their first name. You might get into that, and not looking at their military record, you might find that out on the census, you might not. So this is kind of a good way to check against all that. And again, there's a lot of people in the military, so it's good to get the unit, branch, and company, and especially if you can find them in this Ohio book. Does that age match up, plus or minus a few years? Sure. So that can help out to get things. And again, some of these cards like this one, not too bad. Sometimes one could be really horrible, so you might have to use the other two or just the one to kind of confirm things. So the big question you may be asking is, why all these index cards? Why all this information? Why use this book? Well, probably interested in getting a pension record, right? You could do that. So one thing before I tell you how to do this is, it's a little backed up, which is a nice way of saying during COVID, they closed the National Archives down a few times, unfortunately, and they only allow so many people in there. So I'm not trying to discourage you, but just keep in mind, this is probably going to be a long process, and that is to apply for it and actually get that. They don't send things out anymore on CD-ROM, or they don't print things out. It's going to be all electronic. So you're going to be essentially, if you've used the National Archives, it's going online, it's making essentially an account like anything else, and then you apply on there. So I did give you this form here. It's in your packets, the NATF. That's what you had to use in the past. I just gave this to you just as an example to see like all the information that's going to be on there. But you can use that to get pension record, Civil War or afterwards. So essentially, again, like I mentioned, you go online to the National Archives and you could just simply put pension application, NAFT 85. There's things on there to kind of direct you there, but it's pretty easy to get to. So when you're applying for that, you're going to need pretty much everything I've talked about, you know, especially the unit, the company, when they were mustered in, when they were mustered out. That's most important. The name, absolutely. What about birth? Yeah, but it may be tricky, especially if that person doesn't know when they were born, or if it was off by a number of years. When they died, probably. Where they were buried, may be tricky, but you at least need to know some basic information like that. And that's to get things started, and then they can find the application. But what you're really going to need, most importantly, is, you can see there, the certificate number, not the application number, the certificate number. And you may be saying, oh, there's the veteran and the widow. Isn't that both? Nope, it's two different files, remember that? So if you apply for, in this case, William Harvey's, you're going to need that number there, the 48002. If you're looking for his wife, which isn't listed on here, will be on a different index card, it's going to be a different number, 973409, separate file. It sounds weird, but again, it's a different person applying for it. So keep that in mind. Who are you applying for? The widow, the children, or the veteran? So it's not all going to be together. Really quickly, there's two types of applications you could do. The full application file, Civil War 1860 and later, and that goes up to about World War I, so about 1917. So that could be, they call it the Indian Wars, but fighting out west, Spanish-American War, Civil War, or somebody in the military, 1870s, 1880s, maybe they weren't in any battles, but they served for a year. Could they get a pension? Yeah, absolutely. So you're going to do what's called the full application file. And if you look on the information there, it's $80, but it's up to 100 pages. And you may be wondering, up to 100 pages. Remember, these applications can get pretty thick, especially if it's one person applying. Anything past that, I believe it's 10 or 12 cents per copy, and they're going to give you a digital file. In other words, they're not going to send it to you. So that's really helpful. I've applied for several. I haven't gotten them yet, but it's going to be a digital file, essentially a PDF. And they'll let you know, they'll send you an email when that's due. So then there's another one called the Pension Documents Packets, $30. So it's going to be slimmed down. Now, my guess is what that's called, the Pension Documents Packet. Now, this thing that I gave you called the Examples of Pension Records is names on here. My guess is that's probably what that is. Not 100%, but I think some of those examples on there. So if you just want sort of the highs and lows, if you will, you're going to get that, like that pension declaration is what they call it, that the lawyer wrote. Probably going to get that. Probably going to get a discharge certificate. Questionnaires, which I didn't talk about, but essentially what that is, you know, where did you go into? Where did you discharge out? What city? And that's the check for, like, for example, when you're in a company, you all muster out together, unless you're injured. If you're injured, what hospital did you discharge out of and where did you go? So again, it's evidence. So you'll probably find things like that in there. But again, that's more of a short thing. Not to discourage you about this, but just to give you an example, last year, probably around April or May, I applied for a pension record online. Still haven't heard back. You can go online and check at any time, and they have like a little rubric of, you know, what they're doing, like received. Right now, it just says servicing. So I don't know. I haven't got one yet. I hope so. But again, do not be afraid to look this information up and to put in an application. They will probably at some point get caught up, but it may be quite a lot of time. But let me go to, whoops, let me share this again. Just for the simple fact, oops, I was going to put that on there just in case you wanted to email me with any questions you have. That's my email there, and that's my phone number. So I will take questions now. It looks like we have quite a lot. So let's see what we got here. Oh, panic of what year? So there was a panic, I believe, in 1892. They used the term panic. So basically what happened is I'm skipping quite a lot, but during the McKinley administration and a little bit Grover Cleveland, there was the gold standard, right? Money is worth money because of gold in Fort Knox. So I'm skipping quite a lot, but basically what happened there was a lot of speculation. There was a lot of gold in places like the Yukon. There was gold in California still. A lot of that money led to people putting into stocks. Too much gold was on the market and things crashed. We would say the stock market crashed. I'm skipping quite a lot, but a lot of that happened. And because that gold wasn't worth that much and people kept dumping gold on the market. And there was talk of going on, now we're on the bimetal. That actually didn't get passed until I think it was like the 1930s with Roosevelt. So what that means is now you have gold and silver. So basically both of that is used to basically say that this money is in Fort Knox, paper money is worth money. So there was a panic. Why was there a panic? What does that mean? People went to the bank and took their money out, much like, I think It's a Beautiful Life, I think it was the money where, you know, everybody's running to the bank, taking their money. That's what happened in the 1890s. And a lot of banks failed. Because of that, there was no money to go around. So it was pretty bad. There was what we would call a recession. But because of that, unfortunately, there wasn't, you know, you didn't have a lot of money to fund things like, for example, pension records. So I see my next question, the packet, I can send that to you, George, if you want. Could you put your email in the chat there? It's actually on the sign up site. It's a Google Drive thing, but if you wanted to, I could send that to you. It's no problem. A lot of things are in there, but yeah, if you just wanted to put your email in there in the chat, I will be more than happy to send that to you. So, okay. Let's go down the line here. Oh my, we got quite a lot here. Okay, let's just go down the line here. So Can you get records easily if you go to DC and order them ahead of time? Well, so Gwen and I were talking about that. I don't know if you can go into the actual archive place. And what I mean by that is you can go into the reading room, like for the Library of Congress. I don't think they really have a number count anymore. In terms of going to the National Archives, like for example, a lot of military records are kept in Missouri. It's a big repository. A lot of World War I records and World War II are kept there. I'm guessing what you mean is if you ask and then you go physically to go there to pick them up or maybe to get that. I don't know at this time if that's true. And what I mean by that is because there's such a backlog, even if you say, hey, I'm coming to get these, I don't think, unfortunately, they can probably accommodate you. They just have such a backlog of that. Just to give you an example, again, I've put in a couple pension records, even some draft records, and I haven't gotten anything back, and it's been a year. Now, again, not trying to dissuade you, but I think it's just because they have such a backlog and also because they close the archives just completely. Then they open them up just to researchers, but it was only so many people per day at a time. So I don't think the public can go in there. I don't think, like, for example, if you're a historian, you may be able to get access to it, but they might have very limited. So it's probably best to just, maybe call them ahead of time and see what has changed if you can go there and request. My guess is they may have you put in a pension application request, and I probably should have mentioned this, that this pension application that I mentioned is separate from a service record. So in other words, somebody that, say, served in the Civil War for 3 years and was in such and such a unit, that's separate from their pension. So you're going to have to do a separate application for that. It sounds weird, but remember, the pension was either when they're out of the military, so they're injured, and afterwards, or it could be many, many years. That's why it's 2 separate files. Okay, anybody can put questions in there if you'd like. Let's see if there's some more. Oh my. Somebody says, I have my great-grandfather's widow's application for the Civil War pension. 21 pages. Oh, wow. Okay. For $10. Okay. So you want to look in to see if, basically, it looks like you want to see if she obtained the pension. Okay, right. So, well, that's a good question. So one way is to look for the index cards that I mentioned. One of the things I did not mention, and the reason why it hasn't been digitized fully, is there's a thing called, I believe it's called a widow's service index card or widow's index card. I don't have it in my notes, of course, it's at home, but Fold has those. It's a separate index card for just widows. So you might check to see if that person's name was there. And those will be arranged by last name, first name. You could type in the veteran's name. Looks like you know that. So I would try that in Fold and Ancestry and see if that individual applied for a pension record. 21 pages. That's quite a lot. I'm kind of curious about the about her pension record, but if she was granted a pension, there would be an application number and there would be a file number. And if she was granted, those 2 columns, that would say what are the numbers there, and you can apply for that. Now, again, that's going to be a separate file. It's going to be different from the individual's name, James Hahn. So I'm not sure what her name was, but it would be Hahn, comma, her last name. And it would probably be in some of those index cards as well as the widow's index cards. Not all those have been digitized just yet, but the 3 index cards that I did show you, those have been essentially digitized. I want to say 99%. That's kind of a guess, but usually on Fold, when you look at the records, it'll say such and such, 100% completed. Like, for example, War of 1812, 100% up there, the pensions, probably because there wasn't a lot of people that asked for pensions comparatively. Same with Revolutionary War, probably not that many people. So those you could probably find online pretty easily. Now, if it's the whole thing, that's the question, isn't it? But just to answer your question, you could probably find if she did get one and was granted one through the index cards. And definitely in Fold, you could look for, when you kind of get on that main page there's a splash page, and it'll say like World War I, World War II. There'll be something there for Civil War. And then once you click on Civil War, there's tabs halfway down the middle, and then you can start typing in pension records. There's like a little search box, or pension. Widows pensions will come up there, and then you can click on that, and that'll allow you to search specifically for her last name. And you can do last name, first name, last name, one of the two, and then you can see if she was granted one. So good chances are she probably was granted one. Okay, see if there's any other questions here. Oh yes, somebody put in about the 1950 census. Yes, that's coming out here in April. I'm pretty excited about that. That'll be a good one. So yeah, I didn't know they had. I'll have to look into that. Thanks for letting me know that, Mary. Oh, somebody put in there about inflation. Yeah, there was a little bit of inflation, especially $12. Wow, $200 in our terms. Yeah, it doesn't sound like a lot when you hear $10 or $12, but in our money today, that is quite a lot. But again, it started out at that $6 range and then kind of went up there. Oh. Okay, it looks like there's some help there for somebody that is a friend there, so you could read that under Helen's comment there about the National Archives. They're pretty good about getting back to emails. It may take a week or two. It sounds horrible, but I've emailed them on some statuses and things, and they've gotten back to me. So again, I'm not trying to dissuade you on things like that. It's just going to be a process with things, and I think it's just because, you know, I did this like everybody else. I looked online to see if pension records were available online, and they weren't. And I kind of started looking at those index cards, and I thought, those are really weird. I wonder what the heck those things are. So that's kind of how a lot of this stuff came about there. So does anybody have any more questions or comments they would like to put in the chat or in the Q&A? Awful quiet. Anything? Oh, we have there here. Oh, okay. Mary asked if states kept separate service records. Okay, so I didn't grab that. Thanks, Ashley. So the state repository, let's just say the Ohio Historical Society, I think it's called the Ohio History Connection. So I'll call it by its original name, the Ohio Historical Society. They would have kept some records. Now, what exactly is that? So just in my sort of purview, like World War I or World War II, they would have had draft cards. They might, in the term of Civil War, probably have muster records. I'm trying to give you like a good example of the most. They wouldn't have, like, for example, I showed you that CMSR, compiled service military record. They wouldn't have that. That's specifically National Archives. So I'm not trying to say they don't have much, but there isn't a lot of things at the state level. Like, for example, I know Kentucky has quite a lot because they just kept on to it. They would have muster, muster in, muster out. They might have a service jacket like the CMSR, but a little different. It just depends, mainly because when the National Archives were built in the 30s and 40s, they essentially went to states and they said, could you send us things like military records or census records? So with that being said, some states like Kentucky or New York or even Massachusetts kept the records. So you would have to sort of look to see what they have. For example, for Ohio, the Ohio Military or the Ohio Historical Society, my guess is probably would not have a complete, when I say complete, that is in and out. They probably would have things again, like muster, draft cards especially. They would have had that microfilmed. But it's always good to inquire, and a lot of places have things online, what they have. So it's a good place to start. And they may also have some things transcribed and online. So I would start there and see what they have, and then go up to the federal record. And the National Archives, I should say, doesn't have everything. So they have mostly the Civil War stuff, yes. But even more confusingly, they may not have things on site. So that's another reason why, for example, you might be saying, well, why is it taking a year to get this? They may have it off storage, because if you think about it, remember that number I gave you, 2 million? Yeah, that's probably not there. What amount is there? Probably nothing, maybe some stuff like War of 1812 or even Revolutionary War. So it's off site. So it would have to go and get that. So again, that's just an FYI, what may be taking so long. But last chance for questions today before I let you all go. Anything else? And then I believe if George is still there, if he wanted to give me his email, I will be glad to send you that packet afterwards if you'd like, or I could show you where to get that. So did you want to put your email there, George? Ah, okay. Looks like you did find it. So, okay, great. Okay. So I guess that about kind of sums it up here today rather. I'm so used to saying tonight. But so yeah, we'll just kind of leave it at that. And then, like I mentioned, if you wanted to email me or call me, I'll put this up again in case you wanted to do that. I'll just cut and paste my. That's my email there. If you want to email me, you can just cut and paste that or stop in. I'm usually at the library. If you had any questions, I'll be glad to help you. But with that, I'll turn you all loose, and thanks for coming out today. And have a wonderful day. Hopefully it's going to stop snowing. I haven't looked yet. So, okay, I'll see you all later. Thanks.